You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Hello, world, and welcome to Tales from Hollywoodland, a veritable feast of movies, television, Broadway, showbiz stories, and even a little bit of news and gossip with Julian Schlossberg, Arthur E. Friedman, Stephen J. Rubin, and hey, you're actually hearing me right now because I'm the announcer, Mike Faber. Today, we talk Diane Kiesel, author of the book When Charlie Met Joan. And now, here's Steve.
Hi, Diane. How are you?
I'm fine, Steve. How are you?
Great. Welcome to our show, and just congratulations on a real page-turner of a book. I walked into this knowing very little about Charlie Chaplin's love life, and I learned a lot very quickly. But it's funny, for those of us who don't know, and many of us don't, Charlie's life was a lot more than just playing the little tramp. And I know that Julian's going to start us off and ask you some good questions.
Okay.
Hi, Diane, and welcome. And yes, we really all love the book, and thank you for writing it, because while we know the little tramp, we certainly didn't know so much about him. And I think, if nothing else, we have to give him, because you've made it really plain, what kind of a horrible opening years he had as a young man. His father being an alcoholic. I mean, he leaves the home at 12. His mother is mentally ill and institutionalized, and he grows up so poor that they put him in workhouses in London, and then in the London School for Paupers. He's in the streets. He doesn't have food, and becomes this extraordinary giant movie star. And what you've done is to give us the story, in a way, a mini biography of Charlie Chaplin and a mini biography of an unknown actress named Joan Berry, who he signs. So that's my opening, and I'm going to ask you, the amazing thing was that you ended up getting to know Joan Berry's daughter, who was not Charlie Chaplin's, even though he paid through the nose for it. Tell us about her.
Well, everyone in this story, of course, is long dead. It happened 80 years ago. The focus of the book, while it's a bit of a mini biography, is really a series of trials that involved Charlie Chaplin and this woman who ultimately became known as Joan Berry. She gave birth to a daughter. That daughter, she claimed that daughter was Charlie Chaplin's daughter. However, based on the known tests at the time, the known blood typing tests that could prove you weren't somebody's father, it was clear Charlie Chaplin was not this girl's father, although a jury found that he was, and we can talk about why that happened in a bit. So the only living persons that were still around were the offspring of all of the people who I wrote about. Carol, Ann is her name. She has been living in obscurity in the Pacific Northwest for years and years and years. And I found her doing some really detective work through Ancestry.com, through old newspaper articles, and through a half-brother of hers who lived in Texas. And what I needed to do was convince him that he could trust me enough that I wasn't writing a book that was simply out to trash her mother or out this young, not so young anymore, the Chaplin baby, if you will, Carol Ann, that I simply wanted her perspective on what her life looked like in the aftermath of this. And it took a lot of phone calls, a lot of promises. I would never reveal her last name or exactly where she lived. And she came to trust me to the point where we send each other birthday cards every year now, and we talk probably at least once a month. If she hears that there's a snowstorm in New York, she's calling me to be sure I'm okay. So go figure.
Diane, what made you want to do the book?
The reason is so boring. I had a whole other life before the great state of New York made me retire, because we have mandatory judicial retirement in this state. And I was a law school professor. I still am an adjunct professor, and I've written several textbooks about domestic violence. So there's a connection here. I'm updating my domestic violence textbook, and I'm looking on the internet about cases about domestic violence and custody. And as happens on the internet, you get sucked into other paths, right? I find a 1952 law review article about the travesty of the Charlie Chaplin custody trial and how this trial changed custody laws all around the country. And I'm like, what? Charlie Chaplin custody changed the laws? And sure enough, there was a very limited look at this trial and how the perceived miscarriage of justice by the law caused every legislature to change its laws so that never again would a father have to pay 21 years of child support for a kid that wasn't his. And then once I saw that, I thought, well, this is Charlie Chaplin. This story is a lot sexier than just, a story about how the law changed. And that's when I started looking into it.
Mm-hmm.
How much, your book almost reads like a diary page. Every day seems to be covered. The amount of detail is off the charts. How much of this material was available in records, or did you really have to dig far for it?
I used about five basic sources, okay? The FBI did a lot of my homework for me. There is a 2,000-page file on Charlie Chaplin, which is published on the internet by the FBI called The Vault. And hundreds of pages of this are devoted to the FBI's investigation of him, in which he was prosecuted for a Mann Act violation involving Joan Berry. So that was one place I had. The initial investigation of Chaplin was ignited by Joan Berry's pregnancy, in which she ran to Hedda Hopper to complain about it. And based on her complaint to Hedda Hopper, the LA County District Attorney launched an investigation. They had a file. In addition, what used to be called the Immigration Naturalization Service, now ICE, they deported Chaplin in 1952. There's a 6,500-page file from INS about Chaplin. And then finally, there is a transcript of the Paternity Act trial on file with the California State Archives, which I got a hold of, and contemporary newspaper articles. Remember, in the 1940s, newspapers were like the internet today, right? There was the LA Times, the LA Examiner, every newspaper in the country covered this trial. And so I went to the contemporary accounts.
Well, we should also, if we can, set the scene and understand that Charlie Chaplin had his own studio. He was a gigantic movie star. And like the studios of the day, he signed actors. He discovered little Jackie Coogan for the kid, Uncle Festus, but he found him. He signed his wife, Paulette Goddard, and she did Modern Times. She did The Great Dictator. But he found this actress, a young woman, Joan Berry, signed her for $75 a week, had his affair with her, gave her acting lessons, had her dental work being done. And that begins this, I guess, sad and sordid tale of these two people. What I was interested in, Diane, I'm asking you, is it true that at this same time she was having a romance with John Paul Getty as well?
That is absolutely true. In fact, it's through Getty that she meets Chaplin. Joan comes from Brooklyn, New York. She comes right after high school to Hollywood, like many young women did in the post-war, during the war years, excuse me. And she's hoping for stardom. And of course, she has no contacts in Hollywood. So she's here in the late 30s. She gets arrested for shoplifting. She goes back home. Then she finds out she's got a distant cousin, Sam Marks, who works at MGM. She comes to see Sam Marks, tries to get a contract, doesn't get it. And she ends up in a rooming house with a bunch of young actresses at this kind of B movie studio called Republic Pictures. And turns out that through one of those young women, she meets Paul Getty. And Joan Berry is something of a stalker. And she ends up following Getty to Mexico City, where Getty is trying to develop some type of resort down there. She hangs around down there with him for months. She begins an affair with him. Of course, he's been married 5 times. The only reason his wife's not down there is she's stuck in Europe as taking opera singing lessons, and the war's broken out and she can't come back. This is such a sordid, many-layered tale. Long and short of it is, Getty ends up writing her a letter of introduction. Well, he does, and a guy named A.C. Blumenthal does, who's also down there. And Joan takes that letter to Los Angeles, and through that letter, she meets Chaplin. Chaplin goes on a blind date with her, if you can imagine. Chaplin on a blind date, and decides he becomes completely enamored with her. But you have to understand something that I didn't realize. We all have our up and down times, right? Chaplin was in a very down time when he met her. He had come off a terrible divorce with Lita Gray, in which she had a 42-page divorce action against him, in which she accused him of multiple affairs and liking what then was considered immoral sex, if you will. So that humiliated him. He lost a lot of money to her. Al Jolson made The Jazz Singer. There went, his whole career as the Little Tramp. And he and Paulette Goddard had just broken up. So he's kind of at loose ends. Joan comes along. He sees her as a way to kickstart his career. He buys a script, Shadow and Substance. He pays a small fortune for it. As you noted, Julian gets her teeth fixed or acting lessons, you name it. And, he's going to make her a star. Unfortunately, about a month after they meet, she gets pregnant and has one abortion. And by the way, she gets pregnant by Chaplin, has an abortion. A couple of months later, she gets pregnant again, has another abortion. And now Chaplin wants to put the brakes on their romance. And what he wants to do is make a movie with her. Joan doesn't really want to make a movie. She wants to be Mrs. Chaplin. And that's how this whole disaster ends up unfolding, because they both want very different things from this relationship.
Given that she had all of these affairs with so many different men over the years, particularly high-profile men like J. Paul Getty and Charlie Chaplin, how would you describe her physically? What was it about her that caught the attention of this man? Was it purely her physical looks, or was there something else?
Well, physically, men were completely enchanted by her. I found it rather humorous. Even the FBI agents who interviewed her were taken by her.
Those dirty dogs.
She had beautiful auburn hair, apparently just a very sparkling personality, a beautiful figure, and as a few observers noted, she had some mental health issues. Today, she would probably be considered to have had ADHD. She might have even been bipolar. So there was something her mental illness kind of made her very passionate, if you will, and she had a lot of mood swings, and men seemed to be attracted to that. They found her sexy and exciting.
Well,
she ended up spending 10 years in a mental hospital, later on, which is a very sad end to her life. I'm sorry, Julian, I interrupted.
No, that's quite all right. She had, as you write, she had been diagnosed certainly as schizophrenic. There was no question about that. You had mentioned earlier, Diane, about Hedda Hopper, and Hedda Hopper went really, it was almost like a diatribe. She just went nuts against Charlie Chaplin. She was writing about him all the time, calling him a lecher and calling him this undesirable. And we should also mention that, of course, they started, you get into the McCarthy period where he's considered a communist, which he not only probably was never a communist, he really wasn't politically minded at all. I like what he said. He said, I'm not a communist, I'm a peacemonger.
Yes. He made it very clear he never voted in his life. Well, he was never an American citizen. He couldn't have voted here. You should know that it wasn't just the McCarthy era. In his FBI files, as early as 1922, the FBI was looking at him for his possible communist connections. And the fact of the matter is, look, Chaplin was very undereducated. At 11 years old, he could barely read. He was very insecure and sensitive about that. When he comes to the United States and he makes money, he starts hanging out with intellectuals. He says, I love to read my, Schopenhauer and my Nietzsche. Yeah, but on his bed are copies of, a whole year's worth of True Detective, which is where his heart really was, right? So he's flirting with intellectuals and he's flirting with communism, but he never gave any money to the party. There's no evidence whatsoever that he was a member of the party, but he was very loud and vocal in supporting causes, particularly during the war, such as he made speeches about the Second Front, in which he wanted America to invade Europe long before D-Day, and the government wasn't happy with that. So, Chaplin's woes here were kind of a combination of his lecherousness with women, many of them significantly younger than he was, which didn't sit well with the public, and his outspoken political ideas, not his membership in the party.
And it's
Well,
true.
also, his movie Modern Times was very much anti-capitalist, and it's interesting, you're talking about his support of the Russians. People often forget that during World War II, we were allied to the Russians. So supporting the Russians by having a second front to take the pressure off, like millions of Germans coming into Russia, seemed practical and logical and smart. And yet afterwards, you're castigated for doing that. Interestingly, Diane, last year I had Marcia Clark on my own show, Saturday Night at the Movies.
Oh.
I don't know if you've read Marcia's book on the Barbara Graham case in California, also during the 50s. She wrote a book called Trial by Ambush, which attacks the legal system in LA. Barbara Graham was eventually convicted of murder and sent to the gas chamber where she was executed, but there was a travesty of justice. And I know that part of your book and part of your subtitle is the travesty of justice in dealing with Charlie. Can you talk a little bit about how the government did things that would be illegal today?
Sure. Well, first of all, the government was egged on by, this dovetails into what Julian was talking about. When Joan got pregnant and Charlie wouldn't marry her, and part of the reason he wouldn't marry her is because by now the 54-year-old Chaplin was dating 17-year-old Una O'Neill, so there was no room in his life for Joan. She goes and tattles to Hedda Hopper and says, I'm pregnant. Hedda Hopper teams up with a very famous at the time Daily News writer named Flora Belmure. She's the LA bureau chief of the New York Daily News. And everybody's afraid of Flora Belmure. She's a crime writer. She goes to the LA district attorney and says, look, when are you going to investigate Chaplin? Here's a guy who's got communist ideas. He's got 2 teenage boys, and he's keeping a 17-year-old girl, in his house. And, oh, by the way, he got this other girl pregnant, and 2 years ago or last year, he paid for abortions for her. When are you going to investigate him? The LA County DA investigates, comes up empty-handed. The doctor who gave Joan her abortions, they couldn't get anybody to talk. Let's just leave it at that. So what happens next is interesting. J. Edgar Hoover was a big fan of Hedda Hopper's. He reads Hedda Hopper's column about this, And there's a note to the file in the FBI file saying, shouldn't we track this down? And he initiates this investigation. And it is so clear. The FBI interviews about 140 people. First of all, Joan's story changes all over the place. They can't pin her down as to what actually happened. There's no evidence of a Mann Act violation here, but nonetheless, a very young, ambitious United States attorney in Los Angeles prosecutes this case, even though the Maine Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. says, we don't know what you got here. Walk this one slowly. And what the Mann Act violation case is all about is that when Joan Berry decided that Chaplin wasn't going to marry her, she wanted her contract canceled and she wanted to go back home to New York. She asked Chaplin to give her money to do that. He was only too happy to give her money to do that, to get rid of her, okay? He buys her a train ticket home. He gives her a couple of $100. Off she goes. He then goes about a month later to Madison Square Garden to make one of these second front speeches. Joan, who today we'd call a stalker, finds out about it, goes to see the speech. They end up meeting up afterwards a few days later. They probably have sex at the Waldorf Astoria where Chaplin is staying. She complains that she's got no money. He throws her a couple of $100. What does she do with it? She goes back to California. On that flimsy thread, the FBI has decided that he's violated the Mann Act by paying for Joan to cross state lines so they could have sex, i.e., sending a woman across state lines for immoral purposes. There was no, the evidence was not there. And ethically, prosecutors, I was a prosecutor for 10 years before I became a judge, you're not supposed to prosecute a case that you don't believe you have the evidence to prove. And I just don't know how any prosecutor looked at that file and made a determination that they could prosecute this case.
Well,
and by the way, he got acquitted within hours.
I was going to say, at least he was found not guilty. So
correct. But
wouldn't it be something, Diane, if they open up the Epstein files and in the front that says dedicated to Charlie Chaplin?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. But that Mann Act trial destroyed his career. He hired Jerry Giesler, who, if you're from California, he was the famous criminal defense lawyer. He represented Earl Flynn in his statutory rape case. He represented Marilyn Monroe in her divorce from Joe DiMaggio. But he was expensive, and Chaplin was cheap. He remembered what it was like to be poor. He was very resentful of how expensive Giesler was, and as a matter of fact, made a terribly stupid decision, because when the paternity trial came up, his own son said he should have hired Giesler to represent him, but he didn't want to because he didn't want to spend the money.
Diane, Charlie's silent movie career pretty much ended with the Jolson movie, The Jazz Singer. This is decades before movies had second lives on television and in video, etc. Where was Charlie? Was Charlie a saver? He did spend money. Did he have? Where was his money coming from at that time? Do we know?
Oh, well, Charlie, let's see. He arrives here, practically penniless. In 1914, he gets hired by Max Sennett for the Keystone movies. He's making $125 a week. 3 years later, he signs a $1 million contract with First National Pictures. He made 66 movies between the time he arrived here and the time of the Mann Act trials. And he had one of the best copyright lawyers in the world, a guy named Nathan Burkan, who was actually the author of the copyright, the modern copyright law, very famous New York lawyer. And that guy essentially sewed up so many deals for him that you couldn't do anything. You couldn't make a Chaplin doll without Chaplin getting the money for it. He kept a lock on the copyrights of his pictures. He made a fortune.
Steve, in today's world, he'd be a billionaire.
Exactly. I mean, he was a mogul. Now, mind you, he used to use pencils down to the little nub, and but he treated himself nicely. He had a mansion on Summit Drive. He wore bespoke clothes.
And we should point out, you said that he owned the negatives from Modern Times on, and his feature films. And my company and I were involved in trying to get those movies, and eventually we were able to have them distributed in America, and it was exciting. But you point out in the book about that Orson Welles, of all people, after he's been going through all this hell, points out to him this story that he makes a movie of, which is Monsieur Verdoux, or Verdot, actually. And it's probably the first time Charlie Chaplin flopped, I believe.
Yes, yes. He makes that movie in 1947, and it's Charlie's revenge on women, by the way. The movie is basically about a bigamist who kills his wives for their money. And I sort of, that's Charlie's flipping it around. All these women have been killing me for my money all these years. I'm going to get back at them in the movies. And the movie, it just was a tremendous flop the first time around, although it showed, now it's considered a classic, and movie lovers love Verdoux. I still don't like it, but
how could you like the theme?
Right.
But on the other hand, we should point out that a comedian that we grew up with named Martha Ray has a very big role in it, and kind of in many ways steals the movie. So it's interesting that happened. His movies after that, sadly, the King of New York and Limelight, and then finally A Countess from Hong Kong, he never really came back to be the great filmmaker he had been. And that, of course, had to be pretty sad. I wanted to ask you one quick question. You've spent a lot of your life now with Charlie Chaplin, so to speak. Do you like him? Did you respect him? What's your feeling about Chaplin as the person who knows him pretty well now?
Well, I sort of feel like Chaplin was both victim and perpetrator here, if that makes any sense. For people on the left and film people, they've always perceived Chaplin as a victim of government overreach. And that's partially true. The government was out to get him for all the reasons we've been talking about for the past few minutes. But at the same time, Charlie was also his own worst enemy. Today, he'd have a real problem with the Me Too movement, wouldn't he? I mean, every one of the women who were his leading ladies, he ended up, for the most part, with I think the only exception being Virginia Churl, having affairs with. He was certainly very selfish. Two of his wives said all he ever cared about was making his movies. So on the one hand, I respect his genius. I respect his work ethic. I don't have a lot of love for the way he treated women. And I think in the end, he ended up being his own worst enemy. His son had a wonderful quote in his autobiography. His biography of his father. He said, that's his son, Charlie Chaplin Jr. My father could never keep his head, even in, the most benign situations. Okay. And I think that's true. Chaplin could never keep his head. He could never think clearly. And he ended up kind of creating many of his own problems. So I think I come out neutral. I want
to say that I was having lunch with Milton Berle and some of his cronies up at the Friars Club some years ago. And the subject that day for all these guys was, who were the greatest women players? Who played around more than anybody? And there was Lana Turner and Gloria DeHaven, Junelle. And Milton Berle said the greatest player of all time was Paulette Goddard, who you mentioned earlier. She was all over the place. But Milton was asked the question, tell us about Charlie Chaplin. And, it was Alf Jolson, and he was going through these guys. At the time, Milton was probably about 90 years old, but he had seen it all. And he said, Charlie Chaplin was a genius, but he was a little prick. And that was, for whatever it's worth, that was his comments on Charlie Chaplin.
Diane, you mentioned that you spoke to Joan's daughter. Did you have any contact with any of the Chaplin kids? Did any of them respond to you?
My kind of that did not go well. Writing the book, 7 of the 8 then living Chaplin children, one of them has since died, Josie, were the board of directors of the Chaplin Archive. They control who sees it and who doesn't. And there are papers under seal about this case and about the trial. So I contacted they've got a lawyer in Paris. I contacted the lawyer in Paris and said I would like to go to the archive, go through this, perhaps speak to the older children who might still remember when they had to leave California. And I got back a very negative response saying we took a vote, and the vote was 6-1 no. And not only that, we're not letting you into the archive. So basically, don't even try and come. So then, like a few days later, I get an email from the youngest Chaplin, Annette. And obviously, English is not her first language. She grew up in Switzerland. I wasn't quite clear what she was trying to say, but it sounded to me like she was the one who thought it was okay to talk to me. So my significant other, his first language is French. So I said, hurry up, George, write her a letter in French and tell her that I'm going to be really fair, etc. So he bangs out a letter in French, but it went nowhere. 2 years later, because sometimes people change over time, right? 2 years later, I wrote back again and asked if there was a change of heart, and the answer was no. So they did not cooperate at all with me. I never spoke with them. I never saw the archive.
One of the things I was taken with was that when Chaplin was this giant star, I guess the only so-called competition may have been Buster Keaton. Mm-hmm. And so they were competitors, obviously. But when he made Limelight, he found out that Keaton was kind of having hard times, and he had a role put in for him. I was very touched by that, and I'm glad that you brought it out. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it shows. I mean, as I said at the beginning, anybody who overcame that kind of childhood obviously has to have, I think, the sympathetic vote. We should point out that in that incredible Academy Award moment where he appears on stage, to this day, the longest standing ovation in the history of the Academy, 12 minutes. 12 minutes. I mean, I don't know if anyone has any concept of how long 12 minutes is, but if you start putting the seconds down, it's incredible. So I think Chaplin, at least at the end, was given somewhat back. Somewhat, he had a return to his greatness.
Diane, can you talk a little bit about his exile? I mean, he gets exiled in 1952 by the government. Did he just accept his fate and live quietly in Europe, or was there efforts at times for him to try to make it back?
Well, when he was first, they really sandbagged him. He's in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. He had permission to return to the United States. Just so your listeners know, if you're not a United States citizen, if you leave the country, you need a reentry permit to come back. Chaplin, by the way, despite the fact that since 1922 they were looking at him as a possible communist, he left the country 3 times over that period, and they always let him back. Now it's 1952, he's on the ocean, they yank his reentry permit. So at first, he and his press secretary, a guy named Harry Crocker, they're making it clear they intend to fight this and come back, okay? However, I don't know what, at some point, I think he gets scared. He went through the Mann Act trial. He went through 2 paternity trials. It cost him a fortune. It probably took years off his life. And in order for him to challenge this, he had to come back to the United States. And I think he had a fear that they might incarcerate him pending a trial. So what he does is he sends Una O'Neill, who's then his wife, back. She's a citizen. She comes to the United States. She attends the United Artists board meeting because he's still a part owner of United Artists. She closes up the mansion on Summit Drive. She cleans out the bank accounts. She comes back, and then she renounces her citizenship. He returns the reentry permit and says, no thanks, I'll see you. And they move to Switzerland. Now, I don't think the Swiss experience is all that great. He recreates California, which I find hilarious. He builds a built-in pool in Switzerland. He builds a barbecue pit. Some writer from the Saturday Evening Post says they're as Californian as a pair of avocados. It's a wonderful expression. I think, because I read those 6,000 pages of INS reports, they didn't have a leg to stand on. If he had challenged this, there are only two reasons they could have kept him out of this country. One is if he's a convicted felon, and he wasn't. And two, if he had been a communist. And there was no proof. There was never any proof that he was a communist other than he hung out with, lefty directors. So he would have won. But I think he just didn't have the fight in him anymore.
It's interesting. I'm thinking of Roman Polanski being a more contemporary example of someone who's afraid to come back because he will go to trial in different circumstances, but certainly a very high-profile case.
You want to know a very interesting thing about Chaplin? In today's world of movies, Julian and I having owned movie theaters, in today's world, you see these big grosses, huge grosses, James Cameron and $1 billion and what have you. The average admission price today is about $15, particularly in highlight areas of the country, East Side New York, West Side LA, and Chicago Water Tower. It's $15 or more. If they're doing it in IMAX, you're paying $20. When Charlie Chaplin was at the height of his fame, the admission prices, I think, were 5 and 10 cents.
Yeah.
So zillions of admits were coming to see him. He was the biggest celebrity in the world. He and Babe Ruth come 1920, thereabout. But can you imagine? He was playing to packed houses in every 1 o'clock show, 4 o'clock show, 7 o'clock show. But you compare that again to what's happened with the admission prices today, I guess in everything, but movie prices have gone a little nuts. Broadway theater prices are completely insane.
Diane,
I wanted to talk about, if we could, Una O'Neill, Eugene O'Neill's daughter, who I guess kind of disowned her after she married Charlie Chaplin. They were married for 30 plus years, had 8 children. She gave up her citizenship. She gave up her acting career. She gave up a lot for him, did become, I guess, a bit of a drinker herself, and had seemingly her life was being Mrs. Charlie Chaplin. Is that what you found?
Yes. There's a biography of her, and from everything I've read and what I found, yes, she paid a very high price to be Mrs. Charles Chaplin. And the big thing she gave up, think about this, he was 34 years older than she was. Mm-hmm. She gave up her youth. I mean, when she was in her mid-20s, she already had 4 kids. And her life was him. Did it make her happy? I don't know. Again, from everything I've uncovered, she'd had a terrible drinking problem, although that may have been hereditary. I mean, her father did. One of her brothers, 2 of her brothers, committed suicide. It was not a stable family, and certainly, if we believe Eugene O'Neill's, Nobel Prize winning plays, Long Day Journey. I mean, his family of origin had these mental health problems. So,
well, I would say the cast of characters had real problems, whether it was Chaplin, Una, I mean, and certainly Joan. So Joan, at the end of her career, or not necessarily the end, becomes or tries to become a nightclub singer. Not too successful, I guess.
No, you know what it reminds me of? Remember in Citizen Kane when Susan Alexander is in that crappy restaurant in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and it's so sad. I always think of Joan Berry when I see that movie.
Mm.
You know, here she had the chance to be the next Paulette Goddard, right? She was going to be in a Chaplin movie. As Arthur points out, the most famous man on earth. He was a rock star. She gives all that up and instead ends up with some two-bit agent in Pittsburgh who gets her gigs in these third-rate nightclubs where she's a terrible singer, where she has terrible straight stage fright. And once again, because she's mentally unstable, she gets into fights with everybody. And before you know it, she and her agent are suing each other. So that's very short-lived. And she's booked, of course, as Charlie Chaplin's protege. Oh, how sad.
Diane, I'm curious to know, did you see, I trust you saw the Robert Downey Chaplin film?
Yes,
What did you think of it?
You know, I actually thought it wasn't bad. It's a mess as far as these trials go, because what the filmmaker does is it mushes the three trials together into one and doesn't really explain what they were all about and the devastation. But the story of his birth, his childhood, and his early days in Hollywood, I think it's quite good.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we've talked about all the people who had a vendetta against Charlie. Did he have some allies in Hollywood who could have helped him with his various cases, particularly the deportation case?
Well, you know, it's funny. One of his early allies, when he was under investigation, and he learned, by the way, that the FBI was investigating him for a Mann Act violation, was Paulette Goddard. I find the Chaplin-Goddard relationship so curious, if you will. She was exactly like he was in the sense of, I mean, Arthur points out she had a lot of men, a lot of lovers. She was as ambitious as he was. She was certainly talented, and they're already separated. And when he catches wind of this investigation, he calls her in a panic. And she's the one who's giving him advice and what to do. You know, pick up the phone, call J. Edgar Hoover, ask him what's going on here. You know, give a big donation to the party. You know, not the Communist Party, the political parties. You know, she's trying to go to the Hollywood canteen. You know, look like a good patriot. So she was certainly always supportive of him, but you know, Charlie was a big lone wolf. He had his own studio. He didn't have to answer to anybody. And he was always a bit of at odds with the United Artists. He was always suing everybody. He was very litigious. He and his fellow board members in United Artists, they never quite got along. So I think the long answer is I don't know that he had a lot of people.
Well, he lost one. He lost one early on in the death of his friend Douglas Fairbanks Sr.
Arguably his only friend in
go.
Hollywood.
I don't think that was Junior, though, was it?
Was it Junior
No,
or Senior?
No, Senior.
Senior. Because I knew Junior. I figured, I worked with him. I'm interested in knowing, Diane, what was the most difficult or one of the most difficult parts of writing the book? Did you hit a snag on some things that you were rather frustrated with?
The most difficult part of the book was synthesizing all of those sources that I told you about earlier. You know, you've got the Chicago Tribune describing what happens in court on March 22nd, but the LA Times describes it a little bit different. How do I synthesize this other than human beings two people see things in two different ways? There is no transcript of the Mann Act trial. The federal government has no obligation to keep any of these transcripts beyond a certain period of time unless there is a conviction and an appeal, and there was never any conviction. I had no federal trial transcript to work from. That was very difficult to try and piece that together. That was very frustrating. I wished that some people in this, obviously nobody's still going to be alive after 80 years, but the children of many of the players, like the children of some of the judges who participated in this case were alive. The children of some of the lawyers who were involved, the United Artists lawyer, Lloyd Wright, his grandson knew Grandpa quite well, but nobody really knew these folks in their prime and could really help me to figure out what they were thinking and feeling and how they were working at the time. So it's hard when you've got all that time, you know.
How long did it take you to write the book, Diane?
Well, longer than it should have, because I started right at the beginning of the COVID epidemic. So many archives were closed. Although hats off to archivists, many of whom were, scanning things for writers all over the country, but it slowed me down. And also I was still working at the time, working full time as a judge. I did not retire until the end of 2023. And by then the book had been accepted for publication. So I spent 2024 doing the editing. So probably took close to 5 years, but it should have been a 3-year project.
I bet you were a great judge. I'll bet.
Oh, thank you. I loved
Yeah.
it. I loved it. I sat in the criminal term for 25 years, major felonies in Manhattan and the Bronx. So I loved it.
What you must be thinking of these days. My goodness.
Mhm.
Oh, boy. Yeah.
Robert Morgenthau at one point was your boss. And
Oh,
my golly,
He's
you're
still
talking
my
about
heart. We
That-
loved him.
There's a hero to many of us.
We loved him. I worked for him for 10 years, and he used to tell us 2 words: do justice. And we would never have a mess like this Chaplin case, because if we went to Mr. Morgenthau and said, Mr. Morgenthau, we don't have the evidence to go forward, he'd ask us to explain, and he'd say, okay, then dismiss. I remember once distinctly, I had a case when I was a prosecutor. I was in the sex crimes unit, and an identical twin had raped and tried to murder his stepmother. Raped her, slit her throat, left her for dead. Identical twins have the same DNA. Through a series of mishaps, mainly because the kid's real mother presented a false alibi, we arrested the wrong twin. So the wrong twin is in jail, and the twin who actually did this is not. Thank God I had a wonderful detective who calls me like 3 a.m. and says, we got a problem. We got the wrong twin. We do a lot of backdoor investigation. I'm like, oh my God, oh my God. The next morning we go see Mr. Morgenthau. Do I get fired? Nope. He holds a news conference and he says, basically, we do the right thing here. We've got the wrong twin. Here's the reason. This is the investigation. He sends me to court to cut to free the wrong twin, and we arrest the right twin. He didn't even blink an eye. It's like we just do the right thing. We don't try and cover up. I love
Diane, this is your next book. This is your next book. This is a great story. It really is. I'm telling you, if I was a publisher, I'd say, let's do it.
Did J. Edgar Hoover ever get his comeuppance?
No, not really. Not really.
He came, caused all kinds of problems, and went.
Well, I don't think he's really thought of by those of us who follow politics as a good guy. I'm not saying it. I think he may not have gotten it in his lifetime, but he certainly hasn't gotten whacked all over the place, and rightfully so, in post his death.
Diane, what's been the reaction to your book? Can you tell us a little bit how people have responded?
Well, I've gone all over the country talking about it. I get very good reaction, but the problem is nonfiction does not sell that well these days. It's the reality. Unless unless it wins some big awards this year, which I doubt, because there's a lot of wonderful books out there, or unless somebody from Hollywood decides they want to make a movie about it.
I was going to ask you about that, because reading your book is like reading a screenplay, because you have all the characters and all the tawdriness involving celebrities. Has anybody approached you about acquiring the rights?
No, my agent's always on the lookout for that, but No, it has not happened yet. So if you guys know anybody, send them my way.
Well,
Diane,
you may be hearing from Steve Rubin.
Diane, you have sex going, you got a shot. Okay?
That's true.
There you go.
Well, I have to say that it's when I thought in terms of Chaplin, I always was hoping that there would be some story that would make him have the happy ending that I said he had, at least as far as recognition. But it turns out that whether it was Marlon Brando or Claire Bloom, Claire I knew quite well, he was very dictatorial on that set. He was used to, he didn't want, and he wanted the actor to do what he said and do it the way he wanted to show them how to do it. And this was, of course, against the way someone like Brando, who kind of came in and wanted to discover it as he was doing it. Chaplin and he were really at odds. And it's sad in a way, because Brando worshipped him, didn't even read the script of A Countess from Hong Kong. And then they had terrible problems on the set.
Yeah. In researching this book, I saw all of his movies. He made 82. I made sure I watched every one, and I tried to read what I could. And Virginia Cherrill, who played the blind flower girl in that wonderful City Lights. Yes. Oh my God, they hated each other because he did exactly what you said, Julian. He must have made her hand him that flower on the street corner when they met like 460 times. And she felt, as you say, that he was just so dictatorial. I don't think he was the kind of guy you could warm up to.
No, Claire said that in doing Limelight, that she had great admiration and respect for him, but he drove her to tears. He obviously was very, very tough. I mean, for Brando to say he was the most sadistic man I ever met, that's a pretty good statement coming from Brando.
Exactly. One thing you did raise the question, you talked about him coming back in 1972 for his Academy Award. You should know, it's buried in the book, Bob Hope was instrumental in getting the country to invite him back. Bob Hope, of all people, Mr. Right-wing Republican. He reached out to the Justice Department through the Swiss ambassador and then through John Mitchell saying, why don't we let this guy come back? Let's let bygones be bygones. And it's because Bob Hope's career began when he won a Charlie Chaplin lookalike contest as a little boy. And I think there was a place in his heart, for Chaplin. And then I guess it was Daniel Taradesh, who was president of the Academy, who then reached out to Chaplin to try and get him to come back.
Interesting.
He was quite nervous about coming back, I was told. And I think you wrote about that, too.
Yes. He was afraid somebody was going to shoot him.
Yeah.
Here's what, so many movie stars have come and gone since Chaplin has left the scene. There's never been anybody quite like him.
True.
No one. He was iconic, and
you mean you don't consider Macaulay Culkin an icon?
Yeah, great. No one's come close. He captured the public worldwide, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, they never stopped loving him in Europe. I mean, the French, they just love him.
Shalom. Yeah.
Well, this part of the show, we talk about the last movie we watched on TV. Does anybody want to say anything that they've watched lately that inspired them?
How about Diane?
What's the last movie I watched on Netflix? What's the last movie I watched? That multi-part, see, it's like, I shouldn't be watching all this true crime after 35 years in it. The multi-part Staircase with Colin Firth and Toni Collette on Netflix was really good.
Oh, very good.
Really good. Colin Firth was amazing.
My wife is agreeing with you.
She liked it too?
I loved it,
Yeah.
One of my favorite actors of all time was George Sanders. And of course, he's great in anything he does. And he made a movie with a great title called Death of a Scoundrel. And of course, I don't have to tell you, he played the scoundrel. And he is so bad. And this movie with Yvonne DiCarlo and Victor Jory, that it's worth watching. The Death of a Scoundrel.
Death of a Scoundrel.
Yeah. And how great he is in All About Eve when Marilyn Monroe is introduced and he says she went to the Copacabana School of Acting.
He's one of my favorite costume movies is Ivanhoe with Robert Taylor and Elizabeth Taylor, and George Sanders plays Brian de Bois Gilbert, a Norman knight, and he chews every moment of that scenery, et cetera, et cetera.
He was great in everything he ever did, including All About Eve.
Yes. No,
Yeah.
sure. What about you, Arthur? Did you see anything lately that you really liked?
You know what, guys? I fell into a movie that I saw 100 years ago, and it stands up and it's hokey and blah, 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 blah. It's called Love is a Many Splendid Thing with William Holden, one of my all-time favorite actors, and Jennifer Jones. And it is a tearjerker, and it makes you cry today as it did 50 years ago.
And you, among all of us, as the man who knew William Holden.
I did, yes.
And it won an Oscar that year for Best Song, Three Coins in a Fountain. No, I'm sorry. That's a different movie. Sorry. Forget it.
But Love is a Many Splendid Thing was a huge best
Yeah, I
seller.
think that was the one I was thinking of.
Yeah, it was.
The thing about Bill Holden, guys, is that he was the best looking man I've ever seen. Then, now, beyond in person, he was ridiculous. And a hell of a good actor, too.
But
So Diane, you can tell us the name of your book and tell us where we can find it, how we can get it.
When Charlie Met Joan, the tragedy of the Chaplin trials and the failings of American law. You can find it in any bookstore. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it directly from the publisher, University of Michigan Press.
Fabulous. And now we turn the baton over to Mike, who will do some aerial stunts for us. Go ahead, Mike.
Good luck with the book, Diane.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'll be sure not to, fall flat on my face again, so it'll be good. You've reached the end of this episode of the Tales from Hollywoodland podcast. Always remember, we couldn't do this without you. We want to hear from you, so please write us anytime at talesfromhollywoodland@gmail.com. Remember, you can find us wherever fine podcasts are found, and you can even find us up on YouTube. If you made it this far into the episode, why not subscribe and give us a thumbs up? Or if you're listening to us, please give us 5 stars. If you're into social media, please check us out on Instagram and Facebook. You can find all our past episodes up there. Before we get out of here, let's check with the guys and see what's happening this week on their podcast. Julian, who are you talking to this week?
This week is the wonderful choreographer and director Susan Stroman, won 6 Tony Awards, and mostly well known for The Producers, which she actually not only choreographed and directed the play on Broadway, which probably won more nominations and awards than any play, but also did the movie. So Susan Stroman, affectionately known as Stro, will be my guest.
Steve, what's happening over on Saturday night at the movies?
We're talking wolves. A whole show about how wolves have been portrayed in media, from literature, The Big Bad Wolf and Red Riding Hood, to Game of Thrones, to Dances with Wolves, to The Grey. I recently read a wonderful essay by Sarah O'Rourke, who is a wolf advocate, and that inspired me to invite her on the show. So Sarah and I talk about how wolves have been depicted, and mankind has had a relationship with wolves for over 10,000 years. And in the early part, there was a strong synergy between humans and wolves, which we're trying to get back to.
Steve, remember the Bergman movie, Hour of the Wolf?
Okay.
One terrific film.
Okay, I will remember that. Thank you, Julian.
On behalf of Steve, Arthur, and Julian, thanks again for listening. This is your producer and announcer, Mike Faber. We will see you here next time on Tales from Hollywoodland. Your Hollywood adventure starts right here. Right here. That's right, folks. We'll see you soon.
Craving a caffeine fix and a dose of adventure?
Join us for the Have Coffee Will Travel podcast, where we sip, savor, and explore the world one cup at a time.
From discussing the latest coffee trends to diving into pop culture obsessions and sharing travel tips, we've got you covered.
So grab your favorite mug, hit play, and let's embark on a journey together.
Brewing up conversations about coffee, culture, and curiosity.
The Have Coffee Will Travel podcast.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping at the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.